Greetings to all our esteemed guests that have joined us this morning, and thank you for gracing us with your presence once again. My name is Enver Lottering, and I am a student at Rhodes University in Psychology and Afrikaans, but I am also a student leader, a community engagement representative, and I am also part of the SRC Community Engagement Executive. I have been tasked this morning to introduce our keynote speaker for today, with an esteemed PhD in zoology 19 years ago, with a specialization in small mammal physiology, focusing on how an animal form and function enables or constrain animals in their ability to deal with environmental challenges, thus allowing animals to persist over millennial timescales. Her second interest and passion is in human capacity development, a necessary condition for responding to the expectations of the South African National Development Plan and the nation's ambition of being a knowledge-driven economy. Her most recent position as a Director of Research Support and Management at Nelson Mandela University provided support mid-career and established researchers and other strategic interventions such as a research chairs, research entities, and institutional research themes to unlock institutional research potential in service of society. Her previous positions as the Director at the National Research Foundation, or NRF, of South Africa developed strategic interventions for purposes of facilitating and encouraging research participation across the national system of innovation. Currently serving as the chairperson of the Board of Directors of the Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency, a lifetime member of Council of the Zoological Society of Southern Africa, and a member of the Advisory Board for the Mammal Research Institute at the University of Pretoria. Fellow guests, it is my esteemed honor to welcoming the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research, Innovation and Strategic Partnerships at Rhodes University. Please help me extend a warm welcome to Dr. Nomakwezi Mzilikazi.
May I check if I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thank you, Enver, for that generous introduction. It is indeed a long way from zoology to a scholarly community engagement conference. Colleagues, partners representing various publics, friends of Rhodes University, students, a very good morning to you. On the 21st of October 1949, a young man who would have a great impact on the South African struggle for liberation stood before the student body of the then Fort Hare College and delivered a speech that planted a seed for the ongoing struggle for the decolonization of higher education. In the speech, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was the president of the Student Representative Council, reflected on the idea of an African university, one which would be geared towards an African developmental agenda, Africa and an African university, contending that the former, while geographically located on the African continent, promoted knowledge forms that are at odds with the histories and realities of Africa and her people. An African university, he argued, would not only be an expression of African thought, but would be an embodiment of the aspirations of African people. This sentiment was echoed shortly after Prof. Kiet's plenary yesterday in this very venue. The arguments that Sobukwe posed in the speech have shaped discourse on the decolonization of higher education on the African continent and the global south. While there may be debates about the differences in the cultural traditions, spatial constructions, economic trajectories, administrative structures, and geohistories of countries in the global south, colonialism is a universal encounter. The colonial experience gave birth to the anti-colonialism struggle and to the global south as a symbolic designation that has significant political implications. At the heart of this is the quest for the decolonization of higher education, which emerges from the recognition that education is the site of struggle. Thus, every educational system is a political means of maintaining or modifying the appropriation of discourses and practices. The struggle for the decolonization of higher education, at the center of which is a demand for epistemic justice for a colonized people, is in many ways a struggle for placing communities at the center of knowledge creation and articulation. This is so because a key feature of colonialism is dispossession. Dispossession as a central function of colonialization extends beyond the violent and systemic annexure of lands and economies to the cultures and knowledge forms that are created by subjugated people. This cultural and knowledge dispossession, what we term epistemic violence, is rooted in erasure. To successfully dispossess a people, it is necessary to corrupt and erase the things that define them, their geographies, their institutions, economic systems, cultures, heritage, languages, rituals, and knowledge forms. But we must remember, as Professor Sabelo Ndlovu says, that, and I quote, as a people, Africans were always there in human history. They were never creatures of discovery. Africans were always present. Africans were never absent. Africa was never a dark continent. Africans always had their own valid, legitimate, and useful knowledge systems. End quote. In remembering this, we are compelled to reflect on the meaning of engaged research in the context of a South Africa and Africa that is still reckoning with its past, and in the broader global South that is still reeling from the effects of colonialism. But we must also be compelled to think critically about ways in which we can foster and strengthen partnership between academics, communities, and institutions in the global South and the global North to enhance the global impact of community, university, society, and relationships. This matters because the very struggle for decolonization and by extension, the reimagination of engaged research is anchored on partnerships and international solidarity. The struggle is international in character, and thus the decolonial practice of placing communities at the center of research must necessarily assume the same international character. Engaged research has increasingly become important in addressing and solving local problems. Indeed, allow me to suggest that engaged research is probably the most effective pathway to impact. Although there can be no contestation that the community of scholars and partners gathered at this 3-day conference agree on the criticality of community engagement as a core university mission. We cannot deny, however, the fact that many of our universities, and at many of our universities, community engagement is seen as a separate issue from the broader academic project. This is evidenced by the fact that community engagement is often a division within universities that works with external stakeholders in a number of ways, formally and informally, through memorandum of understanding, service level agreements, and various engagement fora. While this approach has been helpful in taking universities closer to communities, it has reproduced the idea that community engagement is a form of social investment, and this was contested heavily yesterday, of course, and rightly so. It's such a social investment to communities rather than a philosophical and practical underpinning that must govern the academic project. Community engagement, if it is to serve as an important vehicle for epistemic justice, must extend to the knowledge forms that are used in learning, teaching, and research. This means that communities must be engaged not only as recipients of social investment by universities, but as equally knowledgeable others. These knowledgeable others become equal partners in knowledge co-creation, and by so doing, facilitate the transfer of knowledges and epistemes that inform academic curricula. We heard yesterday afternoon that within the South African context, the National Research Foundation, or NRF, Engaged Research Framework was presented, and it provides us with a useful and practical set for engaging community and society across the full cycle of research. According to this framework, engagement of communities in the research process can be realized across the full cycle of research. Upstream of research, during identification and development of research priorities and strategies, and the formulation of research questions and proposals. Midstream of research, through the involvement of publics and communities within the research process itself, such as data gathering. Downstream of research, through ensuring that there is utilization of research and innovation outputs and impacts by engagement with communities once the research has been concluded. Whilst this framework is a very powerful tool, researchers must still contend with the tensions arising from our own institutional processes for acquisition of ethical clearance to conduct studies, the long and necessary time frames required to build relationships with communities, and of course, the never-ending pressure associated with university measures such as throughput rate, success rate, and of course, increased research output production. Indeed, these tensions have been the subject of much discussion at various talks that I attended yesterday. Here at Rhodes University, we've been reflecting on revising our research ethics processes to provide a more supportive regulatory environment for engaged research. We encourage and enable researchers to engage with communities during the research planning stage, as well as during the data collection processes. The purpose is to improve the quality and rigor of the research, to ensure that the study is acceptable to key role players, and to offset any power differentials that the researchers and research participants may experience. The University Ethics Committee has now instituted an ethics token clearance, which allows the researcher to engage with the community, to workshop research questions, participants, and methods that reflect the interests and priorities of the community rather than the researcher alone. The researcher is then required to follow standard ethical procedures during this interaction, but data collection is not permitted during this phase. As soon as the collaboration between community members and the researchers has been concluded, in the sense that agreement has been reached regarding the research questions, participation and methodologies, the researcher may then apply for formal ethics clearance in the ordinary way and only commence data collection once it has been obtained. I go into a bit of detail on that process because I think it is important that even as we theorize about community engagement and engaged research, we need to start thinking about how our own processes within institutions may constrain or enable the ability to perform engaged research in effective ways. An important point of reflection must be on the assumption and practice that community engaged research is the preserve of the arts, the humanities, and social sciences. This thinking is rooted in the problematic idea that it is only the humanities that should be concerned with employing a sociological imagination in making sense of the world. Particularly in the global south, where colonial encounters have left an enduring legacy, the physical sciences, engineering sciences, biological sciences, mathematical sciences, medical sciences, and economic and business sciences must reflect a transformation agenda. Our universities cannot graduate engineers who do not understand that speciality is as much about engineering as it is about communities, that the built environment must consider social, cultural, and environmental factors which shape our society. Our civil engineers must recognize that their work is to build for a post-colonial society in which infrastructure must benefit everyone instead of a few, as was the case before. Our mining engineering graduates must recognize that mining has an impact on communities and know that it is important to involve communities in mining development to center their interpretation of what development must look like and to work with them to ensure livelihood generation. Our business science graduates must invest in the triple bottom line ethos of safeguarding people, the environment, and profits. Medical doctors that we graduate, working in a South Africa that is diverse, must be invested in the dynamic communities in which they practice, working with both local and migrant communities to address medical and psychosocial challenges. Having said all of that, I must concede that often researchers, through no fault of their own, lack the tools and skills that would allow them to engage in meaningful and impactful ways with various publics, particularly in conducting engaged research. Because we have a responsibility to produce engaged scientists and scholars who respond to the needs of communities and peoples with complex geohistories, perhaps an issue that demands critical reflection is whether higher learning institutions must make community engagement not so much a standalone division, but must be encouraged and supported to develop an interdisciplinary module that is included in the curricula as a prerequisite for graduation. The development and teaching of such a module must necessarily involve academics and the communities in which they are located. This is what co-creation that we imagine could look like. It is therefore increasingly pleasing to learn that the postgraduate diploma in higher education community engagement at Rhodes University has received accreditation. We are hopeful that this will serve to empower more researchers from various backgrounds with the much needed skills and tools to engage in meaningful and engaged research. Perhaps because of a lack of skills and tools, the practice of engaging with communities in terms of the academic project that often refers only to the extraction of data from the community is still very common. Researchers often go to communities to retrieve data that is then analyzed and interpreted within the confines of the university. Even with ethical processes being prioritized to ensure that no harm is done to participant communities and the resultant data, and that study results are communicated, One cannot escape the sense that communities are anthropological subjects to be studied rather than co-creators of knowledge. This is as much a critique of the practice of research in our universities as it is a reflection on the limitations on community engagement processes that start and end with data extraction. Universities must consistently engage in rethinking beliefs and practices that may hinder the advancement of progressive knowledge forms, including those that exist outside the confines of the academy. This may require a radical disentanglement from practices that reproduce some of the challenges that confront our society. For example, numerous leading universities around the world, the University of Zurich in Switzerland, Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and of course our very own university, and several others have rejected the idea of participating in university rankings, arguing in part that the metrics used to make a determination on this ranking do not reflect the context in which the universities exist. While there may be many debates about these decisions, there is no question that they reflect a new thinking and imagination about the true value of what a university must be, specifically the extent to which it fashions change in its local context through engaged research, societal transformation, social activism, and other indicators that are not adequately considered in the rankings discourse. This brings us to the question of how current higher education planning tools can be used to position engaged research. Within the South African context, the Department of Higher Education, Training, Science and Technology has the responsibility to facilitate the demographic transformation of higher education, an important responsibility in South Africa with a history of segregation and separate development. The current practice of linking funding solely to enrollment targets and research outputs does not reflect the kind of work that universities need to do with regard to community engagement. A case must be made for reviewing of the higher education funding model in our country to factor in other indicators, at the center of which must be community engagement in general and engaged research in particular. This compels us to even revisit the question of a differentiated higher education framework. The South African higher education system has historically been defined by differentiation. Some of the differentiation has been the result of historical legacies that have not been adequately addressed, resulting in a great inequality amongst our universities, some of which still find themselves with inadequate resources and capacity to provide for the basic needs of their students and stakeholders. Other forms of differentiation have been policy-driven. These include the categorization of universities into traditional universities, universities of technology, and complementary universities, stipulations in university missions, program offerings because of the government policy and partially the result of the individual decisions of institutions and the resources they have been able to acquire from government or elsewhere. But while there are some pitfalls to differentiation, there is need to think critically about how aspects of its implementation may be very helpful for engaged research. If we understand engaged research to necessitate that, one, higher education learning institutions visit their roles in relation to social and economic imperatives, priorities and societal challenges, and two, redraft their institutional missions, development trajectories, and identities towards a dedicated niche and mission, emphasizing their contribution towards the development of the country, then we must recognize that this means higher learning institutions have comparative advantages. For example, Rhodes University is located in a predominantly rural province where there is also a significant number of small towns. It stands to reason then that the institution should be at the forefront of the development of engaged research on small towns, geographies, and economies. Several campuses of the Tshwane University of Technology are located in townships, dynamic geographies that shape modern South Africa. It stands to reason then that township studies, including research on township development and economies, should necessarily find priority, for example, at TUT. Reimagining a new way of doing research is also a key aspect of rethinking community engagement, for it is in those reimagined just practices that local communities can transform from passive subjects to active co-creators of knowledge. More than this, in the context of post-colonial societies, this reimagination also serves as a vehicle for epistemic justice. For as Ngugi wa Thiong'o argues in his seminal work, Decolonizing the Mind, colonialism deprived the indigenous people of their power to speak. But Arundhati Roy argues, echoing the sentiments of decolonial scholars, that there really is no such thing as the voices, that they are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard, as Professor Kidd so eloquently explained to us yesterday. Repositioning community engagement by placing it on the research agenda of universities is crucial if we are to give practical demonstration to the co-creation of knowledge with communities. Co-creation is premised on the understanding that universities and communities are governed by a symbiotic relationship, mutualism, that they are of equal value to one another. For a very long time, there has been a temptation to characterize the indigenous knowledge system, the ways of knowing and being of local communities as unscientific. This has become pronounced with advances in technology that some have argued render traditional methods of knowing and doing obsolete. But there is evidence that resolving present problems necessitates revisiting indigenous knowledge forms. Examples of this can be gleaned in food security studies and water resources science. In the semi-arid Eastern Cape province, for example, our province, this is especially poignant. It is important to understand that these practices are not a mere supplement of technological advances that our universities are innovating, but a critical component to them. Thus, there can be no question that the establishment of a knowledge democracy is something that institutions of higher learning in South Africa and the global south more broadly should be considering as an integral part of the academic project. Colleagues, as we spend the next few days discussing on community engagement and the trajectory of the community-university-society relationship, engaging and reflecting on past, present, and future possibilities, we must do so with a deep appreciation of the context in which we learn, research, and teach. It is a context that, even with its universal features, has particularities that necessitate greater nuance in how we think about community engagement and engaged research in particular. For our society, this engagement is not and cannot simply be an exercise in partnering with communities and other stakeholders in our academic project. It is fundamentally an exercise in confronting epistemic violence and erasure that has happened in our society and the way of seeking epistemic justice. I wish to conclude this address with this words from Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who has a residence named after him here at Rhodes. You have seen by now what education means to us, the identification of ourselves with the others. Education to us means service to Africa. I thank you.
Thank you so much to the DVC for such a deep, insightful, and engaging look into positioning engaged research on the research agenda of higher education. We would like to take up some questions from the audience.
Hi. Well, thank you for your presentation. I'm Matias. I'm from Chile. I'm studying my PhD in the US now. But I was wondering on something you mentioned at the beginning about the idea of an African university. So, in which ways engaged research is a way, and community engagement in general is a way of recreating that idea or creating commonalities between countries in Africa. And I would like to know if you are doing steps toward that unity as a continent.
Thank you so much, Prof. And we have one hand
But the concern that I have is that the pro forma ethics commission forms, are written quite academically, and I feel that we need to look at de-academicizing language-wise as well, because I think that's also a massive barrier, and I don't know if we look at it often enough. Thank you.
We can take one more question, and then Dimitri would you like to answer, and then we'll revert back.
Okay, good morning. My name is Matthew Shivambu. I'm a master's student here at Rhodes University in the politics department, and I'm also one of the student volunteers at the community engagement division here at Rhodes University. I think the first thing is just to acknowledge the importance of the speech that was given by Madam DVC. There are a number of things that stood out for me and a lot of us in the room. But my question is around how do we position the university and also change knowledge-making systems, because you spoke about the issue of decoloniality. And I'm asking this question specifically just because there are universities in our country that are still not part of this great initiatives of community engagement, contributing into their respective communities. Because Rhodes is not the only university that is located in a rural area. There are many other universities that can also do the very same thing that we are doing here at Rhodes University. The second part about the issue of decoloniality, we know there are divided views on the standard procedure on how we should go about decolonizing community engagement or the curriculum of university. So I just want to understand from you, Madam DVC, how do we go about doing that, positioning universities, producing knowledge, and also ensuring that all the universities, all the 26 universities and others beyond our country also engage in this great initiatives. Thank you.
DVC, we'll have to join you for answering those three questions. Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Let's start with the idea of an African university. I think the central theme there is the idea of place, and the idea of being anchored in one's geography and conducting and pursuing knowledge projects that have meaning and impact for those communities. And I think this is an idea that can be taken anywhere in the world, not necessarily an African university. But I think the original words of Robert Mangaliso Soloko was bringing into question this idea of reproduction of a university from the global north predominantly and reproducing that in a different context, and whether that is appropriate and whether that serves the citizens. I do think that there is an opportunity for various African universities to have some shared ideals and to have some common goals. For example, when we look at the SDGs 2030, although those will soon expire, 2030 is only 6 years away, my own reflection is that the goals that are being pursued will have relevance long after 2030. The idea of addressing inequality, the idea of quality education, climate action, sustainable buildings and environments, all of those are
broad frameworks that we can channel our collective efforts towards. We also have the Africa 2063 vision, which is the vision of the African Union, and therein is a very broad research agenda where all our universities could probably find meaning and expression. In terms of the ethics processes, are we doing enough by doing no harm? I think it's a good start, as a principle, first do no harm. Is it far enough? I don't think so, but I think that steps are being made, for example, in this two-tier process that Rhodes University has adopted, where we provide an opportunity for researchers to engage with the communities. And I think that engagement may also help us with the second issue that you raised, which is to bring the contents of the consent form in ways that the community can engage with and understand, because then you get an opportunity to explain what it is you seek to do in a language that is accessible. Where we say research that is not engaged research, should that even be performed? Well, I would have to say yes, because I think there's value in all forms of research. I think there's value in radioastronomy. I think there's value in studying the behavior of ants. I think, not research that does not involve humans is not the only kind of research that we should be engaging in. And so I would say yes, even that research that does not have a community element and that does not easily lend itself to usefulness within communities is definitely worthy of the street, but that is my view. And then in terms of how do we position, engage research and community research across our 26 universities, I think, our national frameworks already do provide for this, and that it becomes a matter of leadership and implementation at the various 26 universities. But I do think that there are certain approaches that we should think about piloting and hopefully start to roll out in a more broad way within our universities. For example, as I was suggesting, it may be very useful to develop a module that introduces our undergraduate students to the principles of community engagement, engaged research, responsible citizenship, etc., so that it stops being an endeavor that is driven by individual preference. So I'll give you an example. I'm a zoologist. As I was introduced, my primary research focus is on how animals deal with unpredictability of the environment. Other than obtaining permission to work on a nature reserve, a park, or a private farm, I really have no interaction with humans. And so the idea of engaged research in that context is not a particularly meaningful one. However, when I joined Rhodes University, I had been at several universities, and I must say, and be honest and frank and candid about the fact that in quite a few universities, the model is still very much being benevolent towards communities. So you can go teach at schools, and there's value in that. You can open up your laboratory on a Saturday to a local high school, and there's definitely value in that. But it was never, I had never been prior to Rhodes, been truly exposed to the deep, meaningful ways in which we engage with our communities in structuring, forming the research questions, designing the methodologies, choosing the study sites, etc., and getting very valuable advice from communities. And so the first thing I did was to register for the SLP on community participatory-based methodologies. And, my idea was it should be fun learning with postgrads. And I'm really glad I did that. And so this idea of continuous personal development is still very much driven from an individual interest perspective. And I think we need to more deeply embed these principles into our curriculum so that they're not optional. That would be my view.